Hello, I'm Mercedes Stevenson, and this is the West Block: politics, perspectives, and players. The International Court of Justice has ruled Myanmar must protect Rohingya Muslims within its borders from violence and preserve evidence of possible genocide. The UN's top court ruling comes as hundreds of thousands of Rohingya wait for help, living in refugee camps in neighboring Bangladesh. Myanmar's leader Aung San Suu Kyi has defended the country against charges of genocide. Fareed Khan is with the Rohingya Human Rights Network. Fareed, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What does this court ruling say? Is it a victory?
It's the start of a victory, and it's the first sliver of justice that the Rohingya have seen. The fact that the decision was a unanimous ruling is huge. And the fact that in their ruling, the judges cited 4 of the 5 provisions under the Genocide Convention that constitute genocide is really major. It says basically, to start with, that genocide is a term that can be used with respect to what Myanmar did, and it's a total repudiation of Aung San Suu Kyi and the Myanmar government, who tried to say that no, this was not genocide.
Does this change anything for Rohingya who are actually on the ground? Does it trigger a domino effect that will make a difference, or is it a symbolic gesture, an important one, but one where you don't expect there to be an immediate or a real consequence?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. The fact is the ICJ ruling is supposed to be binding. However, if a state decides, no, we're not going to abide by the ruling, then that leaves it up to the international community to then say, well, what are we going to do? Because if you have nations who are state parties to the convention saying that we're not going to abide by the court's decisions, then you basically have a breakdown of the international rule of law. With respect to Rohingya on the ground, obviously in the camps, it's being received well in Bangladesh. For the people in Myanmar who are living, about 140,000 of them in concentration camps, and the other 300,000 who are living in very precarious conditions, it remains to be seen, because we haven't seen what the response from the Myanmar government is yet. I'm sure that they're looking at the ICJ decision very carefully, and they're going to issue some sort of response probably, tomorrow or by early next week.
What does this ruling specifically require the government to do to try to protect the Rohingya?
Okay, well, if you don't mind, I'm just going to read from some notes here. One of the statements made was that Myanmar had caused irreparable damage to the rights of the Rohingya. So that basically says that what the government has done has destroyed their human rights. It also found that there was a condition of urgency that had to be met in this case. There were 6 provisional measures that required Myanmar to act with immediate, and to quote, with immediate effect to prevent further genocide of the Rohingya group, and to take steps not to destroy or render inaccessible any evidence already described in the application. And it also calls on Myanmar to take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Articles 2 of the Genocide Convention, and particularly it refers to Clause 1, which is killing members of the group, Clause 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the group, Clause 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction in whole or in part, and Clause 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. So this was a major, major decision, and now it remains to be seen whether Myanmar is actually going to listen and abide by this decision. And now we have to wait for the next steps, because this is just provisional measures. And one of the things that should be noted, that one of the other statements in the decision was that this does not prejudice the actual case that will be still to come with regard to genocide being committed that has yet to begin.
So that's a separate case, and we have to see how the government of Myanmar responds to this particular ruling. Do you have any faith that they're going to change the way that they've been behaving?
I would like to say that I have hope. I mean, I think Rohingya, who are in the diaspora and who are living in camps, I mean, all they have is hope. But whether the government, given its history, 40 years of a genocide policy targeting the Rohingya, whether it's actually going to abide by this decision, we will have to wait and see. And if it doesn't, then that leaves it up to countries like Canada and others who say that they're defenders of the international rule of law and, our rules of law nation, than to say, well, are we going to do anything?
Well, and I found it really interesting that Gambia was the country that brought the charges in this case. It wasn't Canada, it wasn't the United States.
Yeah.
Where is the Canadian government on this file in terms of not just what they're saying, but what they're doing? Because I know we talked about a year ago about some of the expectations that you had for the government, things you thought they should be doing. Where are they at in terms of actually taking action here, other than the statements and the words?
Well, the only action that Canada has taken in any meaningful way has been on the humanitarian aid front, which is actually huge. $300 million over 3 years is a substantial amount of money. But on the legal front, with respect to actually filing the genocide case, we had called on the Canadian government to file the genocide case on behalf of the Rohingya, especially after Parliament recognized unanimously in 2 motions that genocide was being committed. And we've pretty much been given the cold shoulder. We did a annual end-of-year report in December, which we basically gave the government an overall C- rating, and in 2 categories with respect to action on the legal front. We gave them an F because, frankly, they've failed, and they've failed in a very huge way. You can't be a nation, and the Prime Minister and former Foreign Affairs Minister used to say this often, we're a rule of law nation, we support the international legal order. You can't make those statements and then not back them up with actual action.
Well, and what's happened to the Rohingya has been absolutely terrible. There are other minority groups around the world as well that are being targeted, for example, the Uyghurs in China. You're critical of the government's record when it comes to the Rohingya, and you're mentioning rule of law, which immediately makes me think of every time we hear the government talk about Huawei, China, in the case of the 2 Michaels who are detained, Canadian citizens detained in China. How do you feel this government is performing when it comes to protections of vulnerable minority groups?
Frankly, I think it's a failing grade, because you mentioned the Uyghurs. There are other minorities that are being persecuted in other parts of the world. You've got what's happening in Kashmir, where there's been a lockdown now since the summer, where atrocities have been committed. You've got what India is doing to other minorities within India proper. There's other minorities being affected, and Canada, if it wants to be seen as this nation that upholds the rule of law, actually has to take action. It has to put action behind those words. And we saw a decade in the 2010s of atrocities committed in different parts of the world, but the nations that are supposed to be the rule of law nations, the Canadian allies, the Western democracies, have seem to have washed their hands of their responsibility. They were the ones that established the international legal order after World War II. They were the ones that pushed for the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They are state parties to these 2 foundational documents of the UN, and yet in the last decade or so, we have seen no real meaningful actions by whether it's Canada or other nations with regard to the Rohingya, the Uyghurs, you name it. There's been so many.
We just have a few moments left, but I'd like to know, I guess, why you think that is, that countries that had a long history of defending human rights and setting out these international legal norms are now going quiet on the same files instead of being vocal and taking action.
Money, trade, jobs, ultimately greed. I'm sorry, but that's the only way I can put it, because if you're putting, international trade and the dollars that are coming in ahead of basic humanity and human dignity and human lives, then you don't have a moral compass. And I would say that for whether it's Canada or the UK, US, any Western nation that does trade with nations that are committing atrocities against people within their borders. Next week is Holocaust Remembrance Day. And we'll have politicians standing up and talking about that and how horrible it was and how we can't let it happen again. And it is absolute hypocrisy to be making those statements. And then when you're called on to act, when the same sorts of things are happening right now, today, you're basically saying, well, yeah, you know what, we're more interested in how many jobs we can get by trading with such and such a nation. So it's a very dismal outlook, and I'm sure that, it's a response that I wish I could respond better, but that's the way things look right now.
Fareed Khan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me again.
That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mercedes Stevenson.